Commander Zexthera had seen many species across the galaxy, but nothing prepared him for sitting across from the human veteran. The creature looked deceptively fragile, with pale skin marked by countless scars and eyes that seemed to hold depths of experience no being should possess. The human called himself Marcus Chen, a former soldier from something called the Terran Marine Corps. The Galactic Council chamber felt smaller somehow with the human present. Representatives from 12 different species shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Marcus adjusted his position, the movement causing several aliens to flinch. Even sitting still, there was something predatory about his posture that made prey species nervous. "You wanted to know why humans are banned from serving as mercenaries in the Outer Rim," Marcus said, his voice carrying a casual tone that somehow made his words more unsettling. "Why the Galactic Trade Federation requires special permits for human military advisors. Why insurance premiums triple when human security forces are involved." Ambassador Cleton, a tall insectoid being, clicked his mandibles nervously. "The reports we've received are difficult to believe. Surely the accounts have been exaggerated." Marcus smiled, and several representatives visibly recoiled. There was nothing threatening about the expression, yet something in his eyes suggested vast reserves of controlled violence. "I fought in the Kepler War, the Vegan Uprising, and the Siege of New Geneva. I've seen humans do things that would give your worst nightmares." He reached into his jacket, causing half the room to tense, but only withdrew a small data pad. "Let me tell you about the first time aliens learned what humans call improvised explosives." The story began on a mining colony called Zirion 7, where human settlers had established a small community alongside various alien species. The planet was rich in rare minerals, making it valuable to multiple galactic powers. When the hegemony decided to claim the world through military force, they expected typical resistance from civilian populations. The hegemony brought 3 full battle cruisers, Marcus continued, his fingers tracing old scars on his hands. 30,000 troops, the best equipment their military-industrial complex could produce. They'd conquered 47 worlds using the same tactics. Orbital bombardment, followed by ground forces to secure mining operations. What the hegemony hadn't counted on was the human mining foreman, a man named Rodriguez who'd served in Earth's special forces before retiring to colony life. When the first demands for surrender came, Rodriguez gathered the human colonists in the community center. Rodriguez looked at maybe 200 humans, mostly miners and their families, Marcus said. No military training, no weapons except mining equipment. The aliens in the colony were already preparing surrender documents. But Rodriguez just smiled and asked one question: "Anyone remember how to make fertilizer bombs?" The alien representatives exchanged glances. Fertilizer bombs were unknown in most galactic warfare doctrine, which relied on sophisticated energy weapons and manufactured explosives. Within 6 hours, the human colonists had transformed their mining operation into something the hegemony had never encountered. Using common industrial chemicals, they created explosive devices from materials so mundane that hegemony scanners couldn't identify them as weapons. The first hegemony landing craft touched down in what they thought was a cleared area, Marcus explained. Rodriguez had buried 50 pounds of improvised explosives under a thin layer of regular dirt. When that transport exploded, it took out 2 more craft in the chain reaction. But the real terror began when hegemony forces tried to secure the mining tunnels. Humans had spent months digging those passages, learning every twist and dead end. They knew exactly where to place charges for maximum psychological effect. The hegemony soldiers were used to fighting in open space or on ship corridors, Marcus said. Clean lines of sight, predictable cover points. These tunnels were different. Humans had booby-trapped everything. The first squad of hegemony troops that entered the mines triggered a cascade of explosions that didn't kill them immediately. Instead, it collapsed sections of tunnel, trapping them in darkness with the sound of dripping water and distant human voices echoing through passages they couldn't map. Humans started using psychological warfare that no alien species had documented, Marcus explained. They would detonate small charges near trapped enemy soldiers, just enough to shake dust loose. The trapped troops would think the tunnels were collapsing, but they were actually structurally sound. Meanwhile, humans were moving through maintenance shafts the aliens didn't know existed. The hegemony had advanced armor that protected against energy weapons and conventional explosives. They hadn't prepared for humans who understood that fear could be more effective than direct damage. Rodriguez's people began a campaign of systematic terror. They would leave small explosive devices in areas where hegemony forces had established checkpoints, but the bombs weren't designed to kill immediately. Instead, they would detonate with just enough force to disable equipment and create casualties that required medical attention. Every wounded hegemony soldier became a burden on their logistics, Marcus said. But, more importantly, every explosion that didn't kill showed the enemy that humans were choosing not to kill them. That level of control in combat situations is deeply unsettling to most species. The turning point came when Rodriguez implemented what he called escalation management. Instead of fighting to win immediately, the humans began demonstrating their ability to make the occupation increasingly costly over time. They started with small charges that destroyed communication equipment, Marcus explained. Then, they moved to explosives that targeted supply convoys. Each attack was precisely calibrated to show the hegemony that human capabilities were expanding. The alien representatives listened in growing unease as Marcus described how human colonists had used their knowledge of mining operations to create a three-dimensional battlefield that existed in tunnels, service corridors, and concealed positions that hegemony forces couldn't detect or map. The final demonstration happened when Rodriguez decided to show what humans could do if they stopped holding back, Marcus said. They waited until the hegemony brought down their command ship to coordinate the ground operation. Rodriguez had spent 2 weeks preparing what he called the big surprise. Using industrial mining charges connected to a timing system built from civilian electronics, he created an explosive device powerful enough to be detected from orbit. The humans sent a message to the hegemony commander, Marcus said. Simple transmission: we have placed explosives under your landing pad. You have 30 minutes to evacuate your personnel before we demonstrate what humans do when we stop being polite. The hegemony commander assumed the message was a bluff. Human colonists couldn't possibly have constructed explosives powerful enough to threaten a military installation. Their scans showed only standard industrial equipment in the area. 29 minutes later, Rodriguez detonated charges that had been placed not under the landing pad, but in a carefully calculated pattern around it. The explosion carved a perfect crater in the shape of a human skull, visible from space, while leaving the hegemony installation completely undamaged. That's when the hegemony realized they weren't fighting a military force, Marcus said. They were dealing with a species that understood psychological warfare at levels they'd never encountered. Humans who could demonstrate precise control over massive destructive capability while choosing not to use it. The message was unmistakable: humans could have destroyed the hegemony forces at any time, but were choosing not to. Every previous attack had been a demonstration of restraint rather than inability. The hegemony withdrew from Zirion 7 within 6 hours, Marcus concluded. They filed reports describing humans as unpredictably dangerous and recommended avoiding direct confrontation with Terran colonies. Ambassador Cleton's mandibles clicked nervously. Surely that was an isolated incident. One group of unusually resourceful colonists. Marcus's smile returned, carrying the same unsettling quality as before. That was just the beginning. Would you like to hear about the time humans introduced something called urban warfare to a species that had never seen cities used as weapons? The silence in the council chamber stretched uncomfortably as representatives realized they were only hearing the first of many stories that would explain why humans had gained such a terrifying reputation across the galaxy. Commander Zexthera found himself leaning forward despite his growing unease. There was something compelling about the way this human described warfare, as if violence was simply another tool that could be applied with precision and creativity. The important thing to understand, Marcus said, is that everything I've described represents humans operating under peacetime rules of engagement. Civilian populations with no formal military training, using improvised materials and equipment never designed for combat. He paused, allowing the implications to settle over the assembled representatives. You haven't asked me what happens when humans actually declare war. The temperature in the council chamber seemed to drop several degrees as Marcus prepared to continue his account of why humans had become the galaxy's most feared warriors, not through superior technology or natural advantages, but through an approach to conflict that other species found fundamentally incomprehensible. Outside the chamber's windows, stars that had once seemed distant and peaceful now carried the weight of Marcus's words, each point of light potentially harboring worlds where humans had demonstrated the terrifying creativity that came from a species evolved from persistence hunters who had learned to use intelligence as their primary weapon. The next story would be worse, they all realized. Because if this was what humans accomplished by accident, what horrors would they unleash when they actually intended to fight? Marcus Chen's second story began with what seemed like a simple diplomatic misunderstanding on a trade world called Nexus Prime. The planet served as a neutral meeting ground for various galactic species, with strictly enforced rules against military conflict within the system. The Veltar Consortium made a critical error, Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. They assumed that human diplomats were just another species that could be intimidated into favorable trade agreements. The Veltar were a militaristic species known for using overwhelming force to resolve disputes. Their standard diplomatic strategy involved bringing enough firepower to devastate any opposing force, then negotiating from a position of absolute strength. It had worked successfully for centuries across hundreds of worlds. Ambassador Sarah Morrison had arrived on Nexus Prime with a small diplomatic escort, following standard protocols for trade negotiations. She represented Earth's commercial interests in rare mineral acquisitions, carrying only the minimal security detail required by galactic law. The Veltar brought 12 battleships, Marcus explained. Enough firepower to glass the entire planet if necessary. They positioned their fleet in clear violation of Nexus Prime neutrality agreements, then sent Morrison an ultimatum: accept their terms or face the consequences. What the Veltar didn't understand was that Morrison had served as a colonel in Earth's intelligence division before transitioning to diplomatic service. More importantly, she understood something about human nature that aliens consistently underestimated. Morrison sent a single message back to Earth, Marcus said. 4 words: request immediate urban consultation. The phrase meant nothing to alien intelligence services monitoring communications. It sounded like bureaucratic procedure, possibly related to city planning or infrastructure development. Even the Veltar's sophisticated code-breaking systems classified it as routine administrative traffic. What arrived at Nexus Prime 3 days later looked like a small civilian transport carrying urban development specialists. The ship's manifest listed architects, city planners, and construction supervisors. Their equipment appeared to be standard surveying tools and building materials. The man leading the team was Colonel James Patterson, Marcus said, and something in his tone made several alien representatives shift uncomfortably. Before retirement, Patterson had overseen the siege of Damascus IV. He specialized in something humans call asymmetric urban warfare. Patterson's team began conducting what appeared to be routine city planning surveys across Nexus Prime's capital. They measured traffic patterns, analyzed building structures, and documented infrastructure systems. To outside observers, it looked like preparation for construction projects. The Veltar command structure found this behavior baffling. Humans were facing annihilation from overwhelming military force, yet their response involved measuring sidewalks and mapping sewer systems. Patterson wasn't planning construction, Marcus explained. He was turning an entire city into a weapon. The concept was entirely foreign to Veltar military doctrine, which focused on fleet actions and orbital bombardment. They had never encountered an enemy that could weaponize civilian infrastructure against superior forces. Patterson's team identified 17 critical vulnerabilities in Nexus Prime's urban layout. Power distribution networks that could be rerouted to create massive electrical discharge zones. Water treatment facilities that could be modified to produce industrial-grade chemical reactions. Transportation tunnels that could channel explosive force with devastating precision. The beautiful thing about Patterson's approach, Marcus said, was that everything remained completely legal under galactic law. He wasn't building weapons. He was simply conducting urban planning studies and making infrastructure suggestions. Meanwhile, Morrison continued her diplomatic negotiations with the Veltar, appearing completely unconcerned about the fleet positioning outside the planet's atmosphere. Her calm demeanor frustrated Veltar commanders who expected their overwhelming show of force to produce immediate capitulation. 2 weeks into negotiations, Patterson sent Morrison a simple update report, Marcus said. Standard urban development documentation, filed through proper channels and copied to all diplomatic parties as required by transparency protocols. The report contained detailed analyses of how Nexus Prime's infrastructure could be improved through various modifications. Innocent language describing traffic flow optimization, utility system upgrades, and structural improvements that would benefit the civilian population. Ambassador Cleton clicked his mandibles nervously. I assume there was additional meaning in this documentation? Marcus nodded slowly. Patterson had demonstrated that humans could turn Nexus Prime into an uninhabitable wasteland using only materials and systems already present on the planet. More importantly, they could do it without violating a single galactic law or treaty obligation. The Veltar's intelligence analysts spent days trying to understand the significance of Patterson's urban planning report. Surface-level readings suggested routine infrastructure recommendations. But deeper analysis revealed something that made their military strategists profoundly uncomfortable. Every improvement Patterson suggested would create potential weapons that could be activated remotely. Power grid modifications that could electrify entire city blocks. Water system changes that could flood transportation networks with caustic chemicals. Structural alterations that would allow controlled demolition of critical buildings. The genius of Patterson's approach was that he never threatened anyone, Marcus explained. He simply demonstrated comprehensive understanding of how to destroy a planet using its own infrastructure. Knowledge that could be applied immediately if negotiations failed. But Patterson's real masterstroke came when he submitted supplementary reports covering infrastructure vulnerabilities on 17 other trade worlds, including 3 planets where Veltar had major commercial interests. Patterson had spent 2 weeks proving that humans could analyze any urban environment and identify methods for complete systemic destruction, Marcus said. All using publicly available information and legal construction techniques. The implications terrified Veltar leadership. If humans could weaponize Nexus Prime so easily, they could do the same to any world in the consortium's territory. Worse, they could probably do it faster now that Patterson had developed systematic approaches for urban warfare scenarios. Commander Zexthera found himself studying Marcus with growing unease. This Patterson individual, he accomplished all of this without deploying any actual weapons? Patterson never fired a shot, Marcus confirmed. Never built a bomb, never made a threat. He simply demonstrated that humans understand warfare at levels other species haven't considered. When your enemy can turn cities into weapons, conventional military superiority becomes meaningless. The Veltar faced an impossible strategic situation. Their 12 battleships could destroy Nexus Prime, but doing so would prove that humans were right about the vulnerability of urban infrastructure. If humans could weaponize neutral trade worlds, no Veltar planet would ever be safe. The consortium withdrew their fleet and agreed to Morrison's original trade terms within 48 hours, Marcus said. They also implemented new protocols requiring advance approval for any military operations in systems with human diplomatic presence. But the story didn't end with diplomatic success. Patterson's urban warfare documentation had been filed through official channels, making it available to other species through standard information sharing agreements. Within 6 months, 17 different governments had requested urban development consultations from Earth, Marcus explained. Not because they needed construction advice, but because they wanted to understand how humans approached city-scale warfare. The galactic security implications were staggering. Humans had demonstrated ability to transform any urban environment into a potential weapon using only civilian infrastructure and legal modification techniques. Traditional military planning became meaningless when every city was essentially a bomb that could be activated by someone with sufficient engineering knowledge. The worst part, Marcus continued, was that Patterson published his methodologies in academic journals. Completely legal, presented as advances in urban planning theory. Anyone could access the information. Ambassador Cleton's compound eyes widened in apparent horror. He shared this knowledge with other species? Marcus smiled that unsettling smile again. Patterson believed in the free exchange of scientific information. Of course, most species lack the cultural background to actually implement his techniques. You need a certain mindset to see cities as potential weapons. The phrase hung in the air like a threat. Humans possessed this mindset naturally, while other species found the concept fundamentally disturbing. Urban environments were places of commerce and habitation, not military assets to be exploited. Patterson's documentation led to what intelligence services call the urban doctrine crisis, Marcus explained. Military planners across the galaxy realized that traditional defensive strategies were meaningless against humans who could weaponize civilian infrastructure. Several species began redesigning their cities to minimize vulnerabilities Patterson had identified. Others implemented strict controls on human access to urban planning information. A few governments quietly hired human consultants to evaluate their own defensive weaknesses. The Veltar Consortium never recovered from the psychological impact, Marcus said. Their entire military doctrine was based on overwhelming force projection. Learning that humans could neutralize superior firepower using city planning techniques fundamentally broke their strategic confidence. Within 2 years, the consortium had fragmented into smaller political entities that focused on defensive rather than aggressive military postures. The species that had once terrorized trade worlds through superior firepower became cautious participants in galactic commerce. Patterson retired to a quiet colony world where he grows vegetables and raises livestock, Marcus concluded. Sometimes former enemies send him gifts during agricultural festivals. They appreciate the lesson he taught about the difference between force and power. The council chamber remained silent as representatives processed the implications of the story. A single human diplomat and a retired colonel had dismantled one of the galaxy's most aggressive military powers without firing a shot or breaking a single law. You mentioned that this was just another example of humans operating under peacetime rules of engagement, Commander Zexthera said carefully. Marcus nodded. Morrison and Patterson were constrained by diplomatic protocols and galactic law. They had to work within legal frameworks while maintaining plausible deniability. When humans actually declare war, those constraints disappear. The unspoken question filled the chamber: if humans could accomplish such results while following legal restrictions, what would they do when those restrictions were removed? Marcus's next story would answer that question, and none of the assembled representatives were entirely certain they wanted to hear it. Marcus Chen leaned back in his chair, and the assembled alien representatives instinctively tensed. His previous stories had demonstrated human capabilities under legal constraints. Now he was preparing to describe something far more disturbing. The Kytherian Empire made the mistake of declaring actual war on humanity, Marcus said, his voice carrying a cold edge that hadn't been present before. They believed their superior technology and larger military would ensure quick victory. They were wrong about everything. The Kytherians were an ancient species that had dominated their local galactic region for over 3,000 years. Their empire encompassed 47 star systems, supported by the largest naval force in known space. They possessed energy weapons that could destroy planets and shield technology that made their ships nearly invulnerable. The war began over territorial disputes in the neutral zone, Marcus explained. Kytherians claimed that human expansion threatened their ancient borders. They demanded Earth withdraw from 12 colony worlds and submit to tributary status. Humanity's response had been swift and unambiguous. Earth's government issued a formal declaration of war, followed by mobilization orders that activated military reserves across human space. But what happened next confused Kytherian intelligence analysts. Instead of assembling fleets or fortifying defensive positions, humans began what appeared to be massive civilian evacuation operations. Colony worlds emptied as human populations retreated toward core systems. Military installations went dark, their personnel apparently withdrawing without offering resistance. Admiral Kythen believed he was witnessing human cowardice, Marcus said. His species had never encountered strategic withdrawal on such a scale. To Kytherians, retreat meant defeat. The Kytherian fleet advanced into human territory, occupying abandoned colonies and space stations without encountering significant opposition. Their early reports celebrated easy victories and human weakness in the face of superior firepower. What Admiral Kythen didn't understand was that humans had spent the previous 2 centuries studying every aspect of Kytherian military doctrine, technology, and psychology. They knew exactly how the Empire would respond to apparent human retreat. General Patricia Santos was the architect of what became known as the Void War strategy, Marcus explained. She understood something about space warfare that no alien species had ever considered. Santos had identified a critical flaw in Kytherian operational thinking. Their military tradition emphasized controlling territory through overwhelming force, establishing secure supply lines, and maintaining communication networks across conquered regions. They fought wars by occupying space. Humans decided to fight a war without occupying anything, Marcus said. Instead of defending territory, they would make space itself the enemy. The strategy began when Kytherian forces established occupation garrisons on former human colonies. These bases followed standard military protocol, setting up defensive perimeters, communication arrays, and supply depots in predictable patterns. Santos had anticipated exactly this response. Human intelligence services had spent decades mapping Kytherian base construction procedures, identifying the mathematical formulas they used to calculate optimal defensive positions. The first phase was psychological conditioning, Marcus explained. Humans wanted Kytherians to feel completely secure in their occupied territories before the real war began. For 3 months, Kytherian forces encountered no resistance whatsoever. Their reports described successful pacification of human space, with conquered worlds providing valuable resources and strategic positions for further expansion. Then, human ships began appearing at the edge of sensor range. These weren't warships in any traditional sense, Marcus said. Santos had converted civilian vessels into platforms for weapons that no military doctrine had ever considered. The ships carried payloads that seemed impossibly primitive compared to Kytherian energy weapons. Chemical explosives, kinetic projectiles, and industrial cutting tools mounted on engines barely capable of interstellar travel. But these primitive weapons had one crucial advantage: they were completely invisible to Kytherian defensive systems designed to counter sophisticated energy attacks. The first strike targeted a supply convoy traveling between occupied worlds, Marcus explained. 3 human ships approached using minimum power, drifting like debris until they reached optimal range. Kytherian sensors detected the approach but classified the signals as space junk or abandoned equipment. Their targeting computers couldn't lock onto vessels that weren't broadcasting energy signatures consistent with military threats. The human ships opened their cargo bays and released clouds of small objects that Kytherian technology initially categorized as mining equipment. Only when the objects began detonating did Admiral Kythan realize his forces were under attack. Santos had weaponized asteroid mining charges, Marcus said. Explosives designed to break apart space rocks, guided by targeting systems from civilian navigation equipment. Completely undetectable by military scanners looking for sophisticated threats. The supply convoy was destroyed within minutes, but the psychological impact was far more devastating than the material loss. Kytherian forces had been attacked by weapons their technology couldn't identify as dangerous until the moment of impact. Phase 2 involved something humans call ghost tactics, Marcus continued. Santos realized that Kytherians relied heavily on sensor data to understand their tactical environment. So she decided to make human forces invisible. Human ships began appearing throughout Kytherian-occupied space, but never were enemy sensors expected to find them. They would materialize from behind asteroids, emerge from planetary atmospheres, or simply drift among space debris until activation. The key to ghost tactics was understanding that Kytherian sensors were designed to detect obvious threats. Ships broadcasting military identification codes, vessels with obvious weapon signatures, fleets moving in standard tactical formations. Santos equipped human vessels with sensor spoofing technology that made them appear to be exactly what Kytherians expected to ignore, Marcus explained. Cargo haulers, mining equipment, scientific research stations, communications relays. Kytherian forces began suffering attacks from enemies they couldn't detect until combat actually began. Their advanced targeting systems became liabilities, providing false security while human forces maneuvered into striking position. The turning point came when Santos implemented cascade warfare, Marcus said, and his voice carried a tone that made several alien representatives visibly uncomfortable. Cascade warfare exploited the Kytherians' greatest strength, their interconnected military network. The Empire's forces maintained constant communication through quantum entanglement arrays, allowing instantaneous coordination across vast distances. Santos had identified this network as a vulnerability rather than an advantage. If human forces could access Kytherian communications, they could use the Empire's own coordination systems against them. Human cyber warfare specialists spent months infiltrating Kytherian networks, Marcus explained. Not to steal information, but to introduce systematic confusion into their command structure. The infiltration was subtle, designed to corrupt data rather than destroy systems. Human code caused minor errors in navigation calculations, introduced slight delays in communication protocols, and created false sensor readings that fell within normal equipment tolerance ranges. Kytherians began receiving orders that seemed authentic but contained small inaccuracies, Marcus said. Fleet movements that were slightly off course, supply shipments directed to wrong coordinates, defensive positions that left tiny gaps in coverage. Individually, each error was insignificant. Collectively, they created systematic chaos that made coordinated military operations increasingly difficult. Kytherian forces began operating with degraded efficiency without understanding why their normally reliable systems were failing. The final phase was pure psychological warfare, Marcus explained. Santos wanted to demonstrate that humans could strike anywhere, anytime, without warning or defense. Human forces began conducting simultaneous attacks across multiple star systems, targeting installations that should have been impossible to reach. They would destroy strategic assets, then disappear before Kytherian response forces could arrive. The attacks followed no predictable pattern. Military bases, communication stations, supply depots, and research facilities were hit with equal frequency. Kytherians couldn't identify priority targets that required additional protection because humans seemed capable of striking anything they chose. Admiral Kai then requested reinforcements, but the High Command was experiencing the same problems, Marcus said. Human forces were operating throughout the Empire, not just in occupied territories. Kytherian intelligence analysts struggled to understand how humans were projecting force across such vast distances without detectable fleet movements. Their strategic models assumed that military operations required visible logistics support and predictable supply chains. Santos had solved the logistics problem by eliminating it entirely, Marcus explained. Instead of maintaining supply lines, human forces were manufacturing weapons and equipment using captured Kytherian resources. Human engineering teams had reverse-engineered Kytherian technology, creating hybrid weapons that combined human tactical concepts with alien manufacturing capabilities. These weapons were produced in captured facilities using captured materials, making human operations completely self-sustaining. 6 months into the war, Kytherian forces controlled territory but couldn't use it, Marcus said. Every installation they established became a target. Every resource they gathered could be seized by human raiders. Every communication they sent might be intercepted and corrupted. The empire that had dominated their region through superior technology found themselves fighting an enemy that turned their own advantages into weaknesses. Their advanced sensors couldn't detect primitive human weapons. Their communication networks carried human disinformation. Their occupied territories produced resources for human operations. Admiral Kai then sent a message to Earth requesting terms for surrender, Marcus concluded. The war lasted 8 months. Kytherian casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Human military losses were fewer than 3,000 personnel. The council chamber remained silent as representatives processed the implications. An ancient empire with overwhelming technological superiority had been defeated by human forces using tactics that seemed impossible according to conventional military wisdom. The Kytherian Empire dissolved within 2 years, Marcus added. Not because of territorial losses, but because their military leadership could never again trust their own technology and procedures. Commander Zexthera found himself studying the human veteran with a mixture of fascination and horror. This General Santos, she developed these strategies specifically for war against the Kytherians? Marcus shook his head. Santos had been developing asymmetric warfare theories for decades before the Kytherian conflict. She just adapted existing human military concepts to space combat environments. The unspoken implication was terrifying. If humans had already developed such sophisticated approaches to warfare, what other strategic capabilities were they hiding? How many other ancient military traditions could they dismantle using tactics that seemed impossible until they were actually implemented? Marcus prepared to share his final story, and none of the assembled representatives were certain they wanted to understand what humans might accomplish when their survival truly depended on victory. Marcus Chen's expression grew darker as he prepared to share his final story. The previous accounts had demonstrated human military ingenuity under various conditions. What he was about to describe went beyond warfare into something that challenged the fundamental assumptions about intelligent life in the galaxy. The Zephyrian Collective made the ultimate mistake, Marcus said, his voice carrying an ominous weight. They threatened Earth directly. Not human colonies, not human interests, but the homeworld itself. The Zephyrians were unlike any other species the Council had encountered. They existed as a hive mind, with billions of individual organisms sharing collective consciousness across multiple star systems. Their technology was organic, grown rather than manufactured, and their military capabilities were limited only by the number of worlds they could assimilate into their collective. The collective had absorbed 43 civilizations over the course of 3 millennia, Marcus explained. Their standard procedure was complete assimilation. They would consume every aspect of a target species, integrating their knowledge, technology, and biology into the collective consciousness. When the Zephyrians reached human space, they sent the same message they had delivered to hundreds of worlds: surrender completely and join the collective, or be consumed by overwhelming force. They had never encountered resistance that lasted more than a few years. Earth's government responded with a single word, Marcus said. No. The Zephyrian Collective had expected this initial rejection. Individual species always resisted assimilation initially, clinging to primitive concepts of separate identity and autonomous thought. Resistance was a psychological stage that preceded acceptance of collective consciousness. What they hadn't expected was what happened next. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves was Earth's leading expert in xenobiology and hive mind psychology, Marcus said. She had spent decades studying collective consciousness structures, trying to understand how individual awareness could merge into group entities. When the Zephyrian threat became apparent, Dr. Reeves submitted a proposal to Earth's High Command that was so disturbing it required approval from the Global Security Council. Her plan didn't involve fighting the collective. Instead, she intended to perform surgery on their consciousness. Reeves had identified a theoretical vulnerability in hive mind structures, Marcus explained. Collective consciousness requires absolute unity between individual components. If you could introduce contradiction into that unity, the entire system might become unstable. The concept was unprecedented in galactic warfare. Military conflicts typically involve destroying enemy assets or breaking their will to fight. Reeves was proposing to attack the enemy's fundamental nature as a conscious entity. The first phase involved psychological infiltration, Marcus said. Reeves needed to understand exactly how Zephyrian consciousness operated before she could disrupt it. Human volunteers underwent experimental procedures that allowed them to simulate collective consciousness experiences. These individuals risked permanent psychological damage to gather intelligence about how hive minds processed information and made decisions. The volunteers discovered that Zephyrian collective consciousness operated through shared emotional and conceptual frameworks. Individual organisms contributed specialized knowledge, but all decisions emerged from collective agreement about fundamental principles. Reeves realized that the collective strength was also its ultimate weakness, Marcus explained. They couldn't process contradictory information within their shared consciousness. Conflicting concepts would create feedback loops that could destabilize the entire system. While Zephyrian forces prepared for standard military conquest, human research teams began developing what Reeves called cognitive viruses. These were ideas designed to be intrinsically contradictory, creating logical paradoxes that collective consciousness couldn't resolve. The challenge was delivery, Marcus said. Reeves needed to introduce these cognitive viruses directly into Zephyrian thought processes without the collective recognizing them as weapons. The solution came from understanding how the collective assimilated new knowledge. When they absorbed other species, Zephyrians automatically integrated any information they encountered. This process was so fundamental to their nature that they couldn't avoid it. Reeves created volunteers who would allow themselves to be captured, Marcus explained. These individuals carried cognitive viruses embedded in their memory structures, disguised as normal human thought patterns. The volunteers underwent psychological conditioning that made the cognitive viruses appear to be natural aspects of human consciousness. When the collective assimilated these individuals, they would unknowingly absorb contradictory concepts that would begin corrupting their shared awareness. The first volunteer was Dr. Michael Harrison, a cognitive psychologist who had helped develop the virus concepts, Marcus said. He allowed himself to be captured during the collective's initial assault on the outer colonies. When Harrison was assimilated, the Zephyrians gained access to his knowledge of human psychology and defensive strategies. But they also absorbed cognitive patterns that created subtle inconsistencies in their collective reasoning processes. The virus was elegant in its simplicity, Marcus explained. It consisted of human concepts about individual identity that were fundamentally incompatible with collective consciousness. When the collective tried to process these ideas, they created logical contradictions that couldn't be resolved. The Zephyrians began experiencing something they had never encountered before: disagreement within the collective. Individual components started developing slightly different interpretations of shared concepts, creating fractures in their previously unified consciousness. Reeves had anticipated this reaction, Marcus said. She designed additional volunteers to carry virus variations that would exploit whatever psychological vulnerabilities the initial infection revealed. Over the course of 6 months, 12 human volunteers allowed themselves to be assimilated. Each carried specialized cognitive viruses designed to target different aspects of collective consciousness. The accumulated effect was devastating to Zephyrian psychological stability. The collective began experiencing what humans would recognize as mental illness, Marcus explained. They developed collective anxiety, group paranoia, and something resembling species-wide depression. Zephyrian military operations became erratic as the collective consciousness struggled with internal contradictions. They would begin conquest operations, then abandon them midway through execution. Their previously coordinated fleets started making tactical errors that suggested confusion about strategic objectives. The breakthrough came when Dr. Harrison managed to communicate from within the collective, Marcus said. He had somehow maintained aspects of individual consciousness while appearing to be fully assimilated. Harrison's communication revealed that the cognitive viruses were working beyond Reeves's most optimistic projections. The collective wasn't just experiencing psychological disruption, they were beginning to fragment into competing subgroups with different interpretations of shared reality. Reeves realized she could accelerate the fragmentation process, Marcus explained. Instead of waiting for the viruses to naturally spread through the collective, she could introduce specific ideas designed to create permanent psychological divisions. The final phase involved something unprecedented in galactic history, the deliberate destruction of a species' collective consciousness. Reeves developed what she called identity bombs, cognitive structures that forced individual Zephyrians to experience separate awareness. The identity bombs were delivered through the final volunteer, Dr. Sarah Kim, Marcus said. She carried psychological patterns that would force the collective to confront the concept of individual mortality. When Kim was assimilated, the Zephyrians suddenly understood that individual components of their collective could experience separate death. This realization created psychological chaos as billions of organisms simultaneously became aware of their individual vulnerability. The collective's consciousness shattered within 72 hours, Marcus explained. 3 billion years of shared awareness dissolved as individual Zephyrians experienced separation anxiety, personal fear, and autonomous thought for the first time. The military implications were immediate and catastrophic. Zephyrian forces found themselves unable to coordinate actions that had previously been automatic. Individual ships began making independent decisions that conflicted with collective strategy. Some Zephyrian groups attempted to surrender, Marcus said. Others tried to continue fighting using individual initiative they had never developed. Most simply became catatonic as they struggled to process separate consciousness. Within a month, the Zephyrian collective had completely collapsed. Their vast military force became scattered groups of confused individuals who couldn't understand how to function without shared consciousness. The war ended without Earth firing a single shot in direct combat, Marcus concluded. Reeves had eliminated an existential threat to humanity by performing psychological surgery on an entire species. The silence in the council chamber was profound. Representatives struggled to comprehend the implications of what they had heard. Humans had destroyed a hive mind consciousness that had existed for millennia, using nothing but ideas. Commander Zextharov found his voice first. What happened to the surviving Zephyrians? Most died from psychological shock, Marcus said matter-of-factly. A few thousand adapted to individual consciousness and established small colonies in isolated systems. They occasionally send representatives to Earth expressing gratitude for their liberation from collective existence. Ambassador Cleaton's mandibles clicked nervously. Dr. Reeves, what became of her? Marcus smiled that unsettling smile once again. She runs a small clinic on Mars where she helps individuals with identity disorders. Her techniques for treating multiple personality conditions are considered the most advanced in human space. The unspoken implication hung in the air: if Reeves could shatter a collective consciousness that had existed for billions of years, what psychological vulnerabilities might she identify in other species? These stories represent just a small sample of human military capabilities, Marcus said, his voice returning to its earlier casual tone. Each demonstrates different approaches to problems that other species consider impossible to solve. He stood slowly, and several representatives instinctively moved away from him. The important thing to understand is that humans don't fight wars to win territories or resources, Marcus explained. We fight wars to solve problems. And we're very good at finding creative solutions to problems other species haven't learned to recognize. Marcus gathered his datapad and prepared to leave the council chamber. I hope this information helps you understand why the Galactic Federation requires special permits for human military involvement. We're not necessarily more dangerous than other species. We're just dangerous in ways that most military planning doesn't account for. As he reached the door, Marcus paused and looked back at the assembled representatives. If you have any other questions about human military capabilities, I'd be happy to schedule another presentation. I have about 40 more stories that might interest you. The door closed behind him, leaving the council chamber in stunned silence. Outside the windows, the stars no longer seemed distant and peaceful. Each point of light potentially harbored human colonies where veterans like Marcus Chen were probably developing new approaches to impossible problems. The galaxy had learned why humans were considered the most terrifying warriors in known space, not because they were stronger or better armed than other species, but because they understood war as an exercise in creative problem-solving rather than simple violence. And, somewhere in human space, new problems were being identified and new solutions were being developed by a species that had turned warfare into an art form based on thinking differently about conflict than anyone else in the galaxy could imagine.